Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar. Our webinar today is hosted by NCSL's Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee. My name is Ben Hush, and I'm the Committee Staff Director for the NRI Committee, and I will be moderating today's webinar, Clean Power Plan Implementation, What You Need to Know. NCSL has been covering the Clean Power Plan and state reactions to the rule since it was first proposed. We encourage you all to check out our web brief where we detail state actions from 2014 and 2015, as well as give a brief background on the rule. This page is updated regularly as state legislatures move on various legislation related to the rule and will soon be updated to show 2016 action. Today we are joined by Jacob Moss of the United States Environmental Protection Agency to discuss the components of the final rule and state implementation requirements. Additionally, Tom Lorenzen from Crowell & Mooring will provide a detailed overview on the legal issues surrounding the Clean Power Plan and potential outcomes of the ongoing court challenges. Finally, David Hoppeck of Duke University will highlight what states need to know and the different avenues for compliance before they submit their implementation plans. Before we begin, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We will send out a notice shortly with a link to these resources. You can also download today's webinar slides right now by clicking on the Media Library button, which is in the upper right-hand corner and is a blue and yellow icon just to the right of the microphone icon. Our presenters will be answering questions after all presentations. Please type your questions in the question box on the lower left-hand side of your screen any time during the webinar. I will be monitoring them and will moderate the Q&A at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Jacob Moss, Acting Deputy Director of US EPA's Climate Protection Partnerships Division, where he helps lead efforts to protect the climate and public health by advancing energy efficiency. Previously, he was a principal architect of the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, and he has over 25 years of experience in leading international, federal, state, and local environmental programs. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start out by saying how disappointed I know Sarah Dunham is that she couldn't join today. She was very much looking forward to participating in the webinar, but her illness today prevented that. So I'm happy to sub in and participate in the conversation. Obviously, states are at one of the central to the Clean Power Plan, and so it's a great opportunity to have a conversation with the legislatures around the country. I think everyone knows why we took the action of the Clean Power Plan and other actions last August to address climate change. We're already feeling the dangerous and costly effects of the climate change in the country, economic impacts to people's lives and family budgets, as well as to businesses around the country. On August 3rd last year, we did finalize two actions and proposed an additional action to address carbon pollution from the largest source of carbon pollution in the U.S., which is the power sector. The first action we'll spend most of today talking about is the Clean Power Plan, addressing existing sources within the power sector. The second one that we finalized last August was the carbon pollution standards that we're looking at new, modified, and reconstructed sources within the power sector. And then the last thing we did, which I'll finish up talking about today, is a proposal for a federal plan and a model rule that both relate to the Clean Power Plan. We are confident that these actions will achieve significant pollution reductions. We're confident that they give states a lot of flexibility and utilities as well, and plenty of time to adjust to the rules and provide affordable, reliable power throughout the entire period leading up to the final compliance deadline. And we also hope that will, over the course of the compliance period, lead to an increased investment in clean and renewable energy. You can see on this slide that EPA is not doing this in a vacuum. There are states and communities across the country that are taking action to address climate change. Many of these states are doing things in a mandatory fashion. Other states are doing it in a voluntary fashion. And cities and communities around the country, as part of the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, are taking action. So all of that is working together to create the climate to address carbon pollution today in a cost-effective fashion. We did a really unprecedented amount of outreach in creating the Clean Power Plan over a 2-year period. We received over 4 million comments and held hundreds of meetings with different stakeholders, and the input that we received from those stakeholders and those comments was really essential in crafting the final Clean Power Plan and giving us, I think, a sense of confidence that we'll be able to do it implement it in a cost-effective fashion and achieve the results that we're after. The Clean Power Plan is a federal-state partnership to reduce carbon pollution from power plants, as I say. It's done under a very specific portion of the Clean Air Act called Section 111D. And under Section 111D, we set carbon dioxide emission performance rates for the affected sources, the power plants, according to what's called the best system of emission reduction. And I'll walk through the three building blocks that we identified for BSER in a few moments. But essentially, we identified those building blocks. We calculated a performance rate for the fossil fuel EGUs and for natural gas combined cycle units. And then we translate that into a state goal and a mass goal. And I'll have a slide that sort of walks that through in much more detail. But it gives states the ability to develop their own plans for the, when I say EGU, that's the electric generating units. Those are the affected sources under the plan. So, the plan gives states the ability to develop their own plans for these sources and to give either the performance rates directly or to have state goals with guidelines for the development, submittal, and implementation plans. You can see on slide 9 here that there are sources around the country that are the sources that are affected under the Clean Power Plan. The blue ones are the fossil steam units. Those are mostly coal plants. And then the yellow dots are the natural gas combined cycle units. Now here's the slide that sort of talks about the best system of emission reduction, again, under Section 111D of the Clean Power Plan, or the Clean Air Act. The first building block that we use has to do with improving literally the energy efficiency of the power plant itself. And so that can have to do with anything from you can see examples on the right: boiler chemical cleaning the air preheater coils. But essentially, it's increasing the efficiency, the operational efficiency of the plant itself. The second building block has to do with shifting generation within fossil fuel categories from higher emitting steam units, mostly coal plants, to lower emitting natural gas power plants. And then the third building block is shifting generation to clean energy and renewables. So that's the zero emitting technologies. And then you can see that that could include anything from solar, wind, nuclear, and combined heat power plants. We didn't do the BSER in a vacuum. We didn't look at each power plant on its own. We recognize that they exist in the context of a regional grid, and we sort of did the analysis sort of based in three regional sectors. One is the western part of the country, and then there's the eastern interconnect, covers most of the eastern part of the United States and the Midwest portion of the country. And then the Texas ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, is a separate grid for most of that state. So those are the three grids in which we applied BSER for the different power plants and did the analysis based on those interconnected grids and looking at how electricity flowed throughout the grid. Slide 12 starts to get into some of the weeds of what we did. So we applied BSER and we developed a very specific standard for all fossil steam units in the country, mostly the coal-fired power plants, and then also separately for the natural gas combined cycle units. So those specific units, which we sort of call subcategorized rates, we start with there. And states can use those. They can apply those rates to each of the power plants and the affected sources in their state. Or if the state wants to, we give them the flexibility that they can develop a statewide rate and then apply that more generally as an average across the state. And the way they do that is by applying the generation mix within their state with the BSER for the performance rates for the different units, and then they can come up with a state rate-based goal. We also help convert that into a mass-based goal. And then the third option that we provided for states is a mass goal with what we call a new source comment. And that new source complement allows states to choose to include some new sources that they expect to be coming online and put that within their mass-based goal from the outset of the Clean Power Plan so that they can take that into account in their planning. The compliance path for the Clean Power Plan is, I think, fairly straightforward, and it changed a lot from the proposal that we had. So now there's 3 steps. The first is from 2022 to 2024, and then 2025 to 2027, and finally the last 2 years of 2028 and 2029. The final standards have to be met on January 1st of 2030. But that interim period from 2022 to 2029, we think provides a lot of a good glide path with 3 interim goals and steps to allow that the performance rates are met over time, and that states can have the flexibility to, in the operational ability in some sense, to meet the goals in a flexible way. We do expect that both renewable energy and energy efficiency will be significant assistance to states as they try to meet their goals. We see renewables as helping under all plan types, so that could be the rate-based type or the mass-based approach, or another one that I'll mention in a moment, to achieve the Clean Power Plan emission goals, and that will in turn then create, not just encourage zero-emission power production, but it would also create economic growth and jobs for the manufacturers, for the installers. It'll lower overall pollution and help diversify the energy supply. Efficiency is very similarly expected to play an important part on compliance across the country. Under all state plan types, it will, like with renewables, provide additional investment in jobs, as well as lowering electricity bills and reducing emissions. Benefits of the Clean Power Plan are substantial, and you can see in the chart on this page, they are in the tens of billions of dollars. Much of that is in the form of health benefits, but a substantial proportion as well in the form of global climate benefits, about $34 to $54 billion in estimated total benefits, compared to the estimated costs in the range of $8.4 billion. Let's talk about state plans a little bit more in detail now. The timeline, I talked about this a little bit, but the Clean Power Plan was finalized last August. The first sort of important date in the compliance timeline is next September 6th of this year. And that's the date by which states have to either submit their final plan or submit a request for an extension for their submittal. If they're approved for that extension, then they can get up to 2 more additional years, which would push back the date to September 16th. And so that gives essentially about 3 years from the time we finalize the Clean Power Plan until the state would have to submit a final plan. And then there's about 3 years and 4 months or so until the compliance ends on January 1st of 2022. And then 8 years until the compliance goals have to be met, the CO2 emissions have to be met in 2030. And overall, you can see from the time we finalized the plan last August until the goals have to be met, that's a 15-year period, and that's the glide path we were talking about earlier with the interim goals. I've mentioned different state plans and state plan designs already in different ways, but essentially there's 2 types of plans that states can take. One is the emission standards plan. In this case, states place federally enforced standards on the affected units that have to meet the full emission guidelines. That can be done in with either a rate-based goal or a mass-based goal, as I've said. States can also do what's called a state measures plan. In this case, the state measures themselves are those that are implemented by the state, and they're not included as federally enforceable emission standards, but they're designed to achieve the state mass-based, mostly mass-based CO2 goal. There is a backstop under that has to be there to make to have the measures be federally enforceable. To have federally enforceable measures to backstop that plan in case the plan was not met by the state, but the actual state measures themselves are not federally enforceable. In terms of state plan development, some states are going to probably go it alone. Other states will work with other states to sort of develop formal multi-state plans. And then other states link with other states in less formal ways. And we've tried to enable that through what we call our trading ready, which allows states to use creditable reductions from out of state to meet their goal without having to set up formal structures for, via interstate agreements in advance of developing their state plan. If states want to collaborate with EPA, EPA is willing to support the option for trading as a suitable choice, for both EPA and for states to implement the CPP. And we have done that many times in the past related to NOx emissions and the NOx SIP call and the clean cross-state air pollution rule and the acid rain program. We think that's appropriate for carbon emissions, and we also feel that would probably ease the administrative burdens on states and reduce costs to both the utilities and electricity consumers. EPA is finalizing state plan designs that would suit state needs and giving states flexibility, and we're also proposing an option for a model trading program that I'll discuss in a few slides. Now, there's a gap, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, between when the state plans are finally due in September of 2018 and January 1st of 2022 when the compliance period begins. That's about 3 years and 4 months. And we wanted to use that period to not sort of slow down any momentum towards clean energy investments that are happening. So to facilitate that, we created something called the Clean Energy Incentive Program, or the CEIP, to incentivize investments in wind and solar on the one hand, and then on the other hand in low-income communities using energy efficiency in those communities during those 2 years of 2020 and 2021. The CEIP is entirely optional. It's a sort of matching fund program where EPA would match what states would probably, in some sense, set aside some part of their compliance pool in 2022 and perhaps beyond to bring those allowances or credits forward, and then EPA would provide a match for that. And it's a 1-to-1 match for the wind and solar credits, and it's a 2-to-1 match from EPA for the low-income energy efficiency activities. We hope that the CIP will spur that investment over the couple of years in advance of the compliance period of the Clean Power Plan, and we've held quite a few calls over the past several months, and we had a docket that was open in November and December to take comments on that and get feedback from the states and from community groups and industry and others. Now, last week we announced that we intend to propose an action related to the CIP that will outline final portions of the Clean Energy Incentive Program and address how the program would actually be implemented. We expect to do that in the coming months, and that process will entail an additional docket for public comment. So even though the non-regulatory docket for the CEIP program that ostensibly closed in December, although it's still open, the comments can still be submitted to that docket. And though the comment period for the federal plan and model rules that I'll speak to in a few moments remains open for another week and a half or so, there will be another additional opportunity for the public to comment on the design of the Clean Energy Incentive Program per this additional action that we're planning. Let me finish up by talking about the federal plan and model rules. The federal plan is essentially was proposed in August, with, as I said earlier, with the final Clean Power Plan. Essentially what it is if states either choose not to submit a plan or they don't submit an approvable plan, then the federal plan is what EPA would implement in that state. And the goal is to ensure the same CO2 reductions that would be achieved under the final Clean Power Plan. The goal is to preserve reliability. We proposed 2 different approaches to the federal plan. It sort of mirror what I said earlier about the state options. One would be a rate-based trading plan type program, and then the other would be a mass-based trading type plan. Both of these would require the affected sources, the EDUs, to meet emission standards set under the Clean Power Plan. And the proposal also meant the Clean Energy Incentive Program that I just discussed under either version of that plan that we would analyze. Now, we will be finalizing the federal plan only in states that require it. So if, in the end, no state ever required the implementation of a federal plan, then we wouldn't finalize the federal plan. If several states require it, our intent at the time of proposal and still today is to only finalize a single approach. So we wouldn't do in some states a mass-based plan, in some states a race-based plan, but we would just finalize one approach, either a mass-based or a rate-based approach, and do that in every state for which we're finalizing a federal plan. In terms of the model rules, which were also proposed as part of the federal rule back in August, what this is intended to be is for both rate-based and mass-based approaches, a model trading rule that gives states a cost-effective pathway to adopt a trading system to support that EPA would support, and that makes it easy for states and power plants to use emissions trading. The model rule essentially does the heavy lifting for the states. It demonstrates a readily available path for them to proceed with emissions trading under the Clean Power Plan, and presents a flexible, affordable implementation options for the states. It does include these presumptively approvable provisions for issuance of emission rate credits, ERCs we call them, for both energy efficiency and renewable energy under a rate-based model rule. And it allows for participation in the Clean Energy Incentive Program under, again, either type of rate or mass-based plan. It also includes standalone portions such as EM&V, evaluation, measurement, and verification procedures for these emission rate credits, and those would be approvable even if the state adopted an approach that differs from the model rule in substantial ways in other ways. So states can follow the model rules that we're developing. We propose them. We're taking comment on them right now. The docket for that closes, I think in the next slide you'll see, on the 21st of this month. And that's for the federal plan and for the model rules. The state trading program that we proposed would adhere to the model trading rule provisions specified in the rulemaking, and when final would be presumptively approvable, as I said earlier. We've done a tremendous amount of outreach to states related to these two rules and the entire CPP. I mentioned some of the sort of headlines of that earlier. I won't go through all of the different resources that we have, but I encourage you to take advantage of these. These are pretty extensive resources in different pages that give background on the rule, background on working with communities, low-income communities and others, a toolbox of resources for states to help them develop plans, a memo that outlines some guidance for states interested in seeking an extension that was issued last October by EPA, and other pieces of it. But I encourage you to go to those websites and take a look at those resources, because I think they're fairly well designed and designed to be useful by states and by the affected sources that are thinking through the process of complying under the Clean Power Plan. And then the last slide here is just simply a plug for submitting your comments on the federal plan and the model rules. These were published in October with a 90-day comment period, and we'll be accepting comments until January 21st of this month. So it's about, I think, 10 days from now. And you can also submit comments on the CEIP related issues discussed in the preamble of the proposed federal plan and model rules. And then we'll, as I said a few moments ago, we'll also be issuing an additional action related to the Clean Energy Incentive Program, so that you'll have an additional opportunity to comment on that in the future. The details are provided on the web link on this page. I think that's all I've got. Great. I'll stop there and thank everyone for having us on the call, and I'll look forward to the Q&A in a little bit.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. Very informative. We look forward to hearing your response to some of the questions that I got in while you were presenting. As a reminder, you can type your question in the chat box at any time, and we will hold them until the end of all the presentations, and that chat box is in the low left-hand corner. Now I am pleased to have, or to introduce, Tom Lorenzen. Tom is a partner at Crowell & Mooring's DC office and a member of the firm's Environment and Natural Resources and Government Affairs group. Previously, from 2004 to 2013, Tom was an assistant chief at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he supervised the federal government's legal defense of all EPA rules. He oversaw many of the last decade's seminal environmental cases, including Massachusetts versus EPA. Tom, with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you, Jacob, for that great overview of the rule. So let's talk about the key legal issues that this rule raises, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the litigation schedule. So the core legal issues in the Clean Power Plan are listed right here. There is what we call the Section 112 exclusion, cooperative federalism issues, the definition that EPA has provided for the best system of emission reduction, the fact that these standards are actually more stringent than the new source performance standards that were issued on the same day. There are additional issues that some parties are raising, and then we have what we call the programmatic and secondary issues, and I'll go through each of these things in turn. The Section 112 exclusion argument is a really fascinating argument. It depends on a bit of a legislative goof. You know, normally when statutes pass in the U.S. Congress and are signed into law, competing House and Senate versions of a provision are reconciled in a conference committee, and those then go back to the both houses for final passage and then on to the President's desk for signature. Section 111D didn't have that usual history. There was a bit of a foul-up in that the House and Senate each passed their own versions of 111D. They were never reconciled through an oversight, and both ended up on the President's desk and were signed into law. And depending on which of those two versions governs, the statute could have some very different meanings. Under the House version, you have what I call a pollutant regulation. Certain pollutants, the criteria pollutants like ozone and particulate matter, are regulated under the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, or NAAQS, sections 108 through 110. Other pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, are regulated under section 112, and everything else, which would include carbon dioxide, regulated under section 111. Under the House version, there is a slightly different approach, and that is that a source category that is regulated under section 112 cannot simultaneously be regulated under section 111D for any pollutant. So here, if the House version is the version of section 111D that governs, you cannot have a regulation of greenhouse gases under section 111D because there is currently a regulation of power plants under section 112 in the form of the mercury and air toxic standards, which regulate mercury and other hazardous air pollutant emissions. This is going to be a fascinating issue to see play out because, as I said, depending on how the D.C. Circuit and possibly the Supreme Court views this one, this argument could not only defeat this rule, but any subsequent rule that EPA wishes to issue under 111D to regulate power plants because there is an existing standard for hazardous air pollutants. You'll see that in my slide listed as a possible weakness of this argument that it could be mooted if the mercury and air toxic standards were vacated by the D.C. Circuit. Ultimately, that didn't happen. The D.C. Circuit left those standards in place while remanding them to the agency to fix an error in them that the Supreme Court found. Another issue with this argument is because it's a threshold argument that would simply say EPA has no authority to issue this rule here, you would never resolve what I consider to be a very important issue, which is what is the scope of EPA's authority to define the best system of emission reduction for reducing emissions of a pollutant. Let's go on to cooperative federalism. And this is an issue that I know is of concern to many in the states. Section 111 has two very different regimes in it. One is for new sources, and one is for existing sources. We're talking about existing. Way of contrast, for new sources under Section 111B, it is very clear that EPA has two roles. The first role it has is to define what is the best system of emission reduction that has been adequately and demonstrated for sources in a category to reduce their emissions of a pollutant. That is EPA's first role under 111B for new sources. Its second role is to actually establish those standards of performance itself using that defined best system of emission reduction and come up with a numerical target that the sources have to meet. 111D contemplates a very different system, one under which EPA still defines what is the best system of emission reduction that is to be used, but then the states are assigned very specifically and explicitly the task of establishing this as a performance for the existing sources and then applying those standards to the existing sources within their borders after considering source-specific factors like remaining useful life and whether it makes sense in light of remaining useful life to give them a lessened standard, a less rigorous standard. Now, in this rule, EPA argues that it has recognized the state's rights to establish the standards of performance for those existing sources and has given them sufficient flexibility to consider factors such as remaining useful life. The counter-argument is that because the standards are binding, and because a state, if it gives one particular source a break based on its consideration of factors such as remaining useful life, must then make some other source do more, in other words, it has to stick to the same target, you've really deprived the state of their expressly granted authority under Section 111D to establish these standards. So there is going to be a battle in the courts over whether EPA has overstepped its role and has trod on the role that Congress specifically assigned to the states. This is what we call a Chevron Step 1 argument, that the statute is clear on its face that the states are assigned this role. It would, if successful by the challengers, not get rid of the Clean Power Plan entirely, in the sense that EPA would still have the authority to come back and do a rule. But it might result in substantial revision of the Clean Power Plan as we know it right now, because the states would go through and build their targets individually from the bottom up and perhaps give some sources a buy or a lessened emission reduction requirement based on their consideration of factors. So you could see a Clean Power Plan reemerge, but it would likely be a less rigorous one with less ambitious emission reduction goals. Now we go to what I consider to be really the core of the legal arguments revolving around this rule, and that is the best system of emission reduction. Traditionally, BSER is something that has looked within the fence line of an individual source to determine what technological or operational measures you can actually implement at that source, prove its emissions performance for any given quantity of good produced, in this case, megawatt hours of electricity. What EPA has done in this rule, and I think Jacob outlined it very well, you have building block 1, which is that traditional best system of emission reduction. Here, heat rate improvement can affect at the individual plant to improve their emission performance, but then EPA goes further. It looks fence line and it asks, what could that individual source's owner or operator do to get further emission reductions? And those things could be generation shifting from higher emitting sources such as coal-fired plants to lower emitting sources such as natural gas plants, or zero emission sources such as renewables, or it could be investment in those lower or zero emitting sources, either direct investment through construction of new renewables, or it could be investment in those other types of generating resources through EPA's trading program and the purchase of emission allowances or credits. And there is a significant argument here over whether EPA has overstepped by defining the source, the individual source, to include its owner and operator, and therefore the things that the owner or operator of the source could do to reduce emissions. One should pay attention to this argument. If the court rules for the challengers here, it would have a fairly profound effect on the Clean Power Plan. The plan could still go forward, but it might well be limited to just those measures that could be implemented under Building Block 1, that is the individual unit heat rate improvement projects, which might reduce emissions by perhaps 2 to 4% tops. You would get nowhere near the 32% that EPA has said this rule will obtain. Another point to look for is how the courts treat 2 years ago, the decision of the Supreme Court in the Utility Air Regulatory Group versus Group EPA case. That was the decision in which the court upheld most, but not all, of EPA's first suite of greenhouse gas regulations. And in that case, the Supreme Court said that it would look skeptically on agencies that purport to find vast authority to regulate broad swaths of the economy based on long extant statutory provisions that aren't explicit. And here you have very vague language in Section 111D that says that EPA may define the best system of emission reduction. You do not have the more explicit type the Supreme Court may be looking for to get this kind of a very broad regulatory program that seeks to really fundamentally transform the way we produce electricity in this country. So watch for how the D.C. Circuit, ultimately the Supreme Court, treat that UARG decision. Is it just dicta from the court, just cautionary language, or is this really now the killing test of whether EPA can proceed with a regulation that is this ambitious? EPA's likely response to this argument is going to be that the best system of emission reduction is undefined by the statute. And because it is undefined, the agency gets substantial deference in interpreting what that provision means. And it will cite the well-respected Chevron decision. So watch that argument. I think that this is going to be the fundamental issue in this case. I had mentioned earlier that one of the issues is that the standards EPA has promulgated here for existing sources are in fact more stringent than the standards for new sources that were issued the same day. If you look at the two rules that EPA issued, and just take coal-fired power plants for example, under the existing source rule, the standard is 1,305 pounds carbon dioxide per megawatt hour electricity. Compare that to the new source performance standard. And for new sources in the industry, they have to use partial carbon capture and sequestration, the latest, greatest technology that is only now starting to come online at places like the Boundary Dam project in Canada, and that is still under development at, say, the Kemper facility here in the United States. It is curious that EPA should promulgate a standard where existing sources, those that are by definition the ones that can do the least to reduce their emissions, are being held to a more stringent standard than new sources. Not even a new source using carbon capture and sequestration can meet that 1,305 pound per megawatt hour standard. And indeed, the only way existing sources can do it is if there is generation shifting within the industry and this trading program with the purchase and sale of credits and emission reduction allowances between these fossil fuel-fired units and renewables. So, and another thing is that this unusual structure creates a problem that EPA then had to address in the rule, and this is the problem of leakage. Leakage is the idea that someone who has an existing, let's say an existing gas-fired power plant subject to the 771 pound per megawatt hour standard that EPA has issued for that plant might choose to shut that plant down and build a new gas plant, because the new gas plants are subject to a less stringent standard of, I believe it's 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour. That creates this interesting incentive to shut down old and switch to new that would defeat EPA's purpose in this rule. And they therefore, as I think Jacob outlined, had to create things like a program under which you would include new sources in your existing source target, or would have to have other provisions in your plan to prohibit that kind of shifting of generation from old to new. Generally, under Section 111, you actually want to encourage a shift from older, less efficient, more polluting units to newer, cleaner units, but not so in this rule. So watch for how the courts treat this issue. Finally, we have some constitutional issues that are sort of lurking here in this case. One issue is a 10th Amendment issue, very similar to our Cooperative Federalism issue that I discussed earlier, and that is that the Clean Power Plan is impermissibly trampling on states' rights. The second argument is a Fifth Amendment argument that because this rule will require the shuttering of a number of coal-fired power plants, it may constitute a regulatory taking without due process or just compensation. Whatever you think of these arguments on the merits, and however likely or unlikely you think it may be that the court will rule on them, there is also a very important principle known as constitutional avoidance that these arguments raise, and that is that the courts and the federal government generally should not read statutes in ways that raise constitutional concerns. So look for these arguments to reinforce some statutory claims that the challengers have raised. Finally, we have what I would call the programmatic and secondary issues, and these are myriad in the case. Calculation of the individual state emission reduction rates and targets. Did EPA correctly calculate all those, or are there errors in some of them? Unit-specific issues such as the achievability of the standard. There is not a single unit in the country that can actually individually meet this standard. All of it has to be done through trading, not through implementation of technological or operational measures. And so many units are going to claim that they don't have available to them the trading mechanisms and access to renewables, lower emitting sources to enable them to meet the rule. So those are also issues in the case. Now, let's talk about the litigation and where it's right now, because these programmatic and secondary issues it's been suggested by the opponents of the rule that these should be basically held in abeyance while the court focuses on issues that I've discussed earlier. The Section 111, 112 issue, Cooperative Federalism, the definition of BSER, the constitutional issues. Why? Because those issues may resolve this case entirely, and you wouldn't need to get into the many hundreds or thousands of pages of briefing that dealing with these issues would take. So one thing that everyone is waiting to see is, does the court agree that the case ought to be split into two segments, or does it instead wish to treat everything at once? EPA, of course, because they desire to get this thing done before the Obama administration leaves in January of next year, is pushing to have the whole thing heard at once. So where are we in the case right now? Petitions for review had to be filed by December 22nd. Many dozens were filed. In addition to the petitions, there were 9 stay motions filed with the court. Briefing on those stay motions concluded on December 23rd. I would therefore expect a decision from the D.C. Circuit on whether a stay will be granted probably by the end of this month. I'm guessing it might even be within the next week to 2 weeks. That will likely dictate how this case proceeds. If the court denies a stay, then I would expect to see them establish a very expedited schedule to try to address the needs of those who had pressed for a stay. If the court grants a stay, you might well see EPA and the Department of Justice pressing for a quick decision, because they will want this rule back in force, in the event they prevail, as quickly as possible. So it is possible that we will see merits briefing on this case in the spring of this year, with argument likely as early as May of this year and a decision in July, or possibly in the fall, with a decision from the D.C. Circuit by December. Supreme Court review is likely to be over the next year in 2017. And I think that, while one is sort of playing with fire, trying to predict whether the Supreme Court will take the case, this is one I think they will take, because the court has shown a tremendous appetite for climate change cases. The Massachusetts case, the AEP versus Connecticut case a few years back, the UARD case 2 years ago. I think principally because this is one of the most important environmental regulatory issues of our time, the Supreme Court is going to want to weigh in to determine what is the extent of the EPA's authority here. So that's where we really are in this litigation. I think that concludes my presentation, and I will leave everything else for questions later. Ben, back to you.
Thanks, Tom. Really helpful overview and obviously a lot to watch in the coming months. Our final speaker today is David Hoppick. David is a Senior Policy Associate with the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. David's current work focuses on state compliance options under the Clean Power, including trade-offs between compliance approaches, interstate trade of compliance instruments, relative cost impacts of different approaches, and how the Clean Power Plan interacts with other trends in the industry. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben. And I'd like to thank National Conference of State Legislatures for the opportunity to present today. For anyone who's not familiar with the Nicholas Institute, we are a nonpartisan policy institute housed at Duke University, focusing on a variety of energy and environmental topics, and we've been focused on the Clean Power Plan for quite a while now. So what I'm going to do is cover what I think are the likely compliance pathways. There's quite a lot, so there's not really time to go through all of them, based on just being part of the conversation, seeing what states are saying in various meetings, and then go through some of the key implications of these likely pathways. So this figure more or less lays out graphically the primary options that Jacob described that are available to states. And so the first grouping I'm going to take is rate versus math. So let's start at the top of the figure and look at rate-based compliance approaches. All of the rate-based compliance approaches are emission standard approaches, meaning the entire compliance obligation is on the affected unit. And there are basically three types of rate-based compliance approaches. So there are the subcategorized rates, where you have rates for fossil units, fossil steam units, and natural gas line cycle units. And these are the same across the country, but they have two different levels. I'll actually show them in a table in a bit. And then you have this alternative statewide blended rate, where EPA has calculated for you one single rate that you could use for all of your units in your state. And then you have the option of coming up with your own rate. So for example, we could assign a specific rate to a set of plants or a utility, and rates could differ across your fleet, including within combined cycle units and fossil steam units. I don't think this is very likely, so I'm not going to talk about it. It's also actually pretty hard to do. Next, turning mass-based options, kind of at the bottom half of my presentation screen here. The first two are, again, emission standard approaches. So the entire compliance obligation, again, is on the affected units. You can just cover existing units only, or you can cover existing sources and new sources. So these new sources would be new natural gas combined cycle units. And this is what the industry is basically building for new intermediate and baseload units right now, just based on economics for fossil units. So most of what's being built that is not a peaker plant, these are plants that run infrequently, are the natural gas combined cycle units. And then you also have this alternative of a state measures approach, where, as Jacob described, you have obligations placed on somebody other than the affected unit. So it can be in combination with obligations on the affected unit. So these could be things like renewable portfolio standards, more stringent billing codes, lots of other things that states are typically using today. They're a lot more complicated because you essentially have to come up with two sets of rules. You have your state measures rules, and then you have this federal backstop. And I'm not hearing much interest in this other than potentially from California, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. So the next thing I want to briefly address is this concept of trading ready, which I've got written in red places. So for rate-based trading ready, is just the subcategorized rate approach, where you have these two separate rates for fossil steam and natural gas combined cycle that are constant across all units in the country taking that approach. And then mass-based trading ready could potentially apply to all of the mass-based options. And for some background on trading ready, basically what you do is you tell EPA, we want to be trading ready. You have a common definition such that you're trading the same thing across state boundaries, and then you have to have a linked or common tracking system. And EPA, as Jacob has described, is basically offering to create this tracking system for you, such that if you're in the mass-based world, you could trade allowances with other affected units, other parties in other states. Basically, you're getting a wider market, and same thing for rate base. So you could trade these emission rate credits across state boundaries. And there's a lot of economic reasons why you'd want to do that, and I'll get into that in a bit. So I'm going to focus on market-based approaches. You can do this without using markets, but it's put simply really hard to do. Basically, you're going to have to project future dispatch, make good guesses at how much your different types of plants are going to operate in the future. So my coal plant is going to likely be at this many megawatt hours, my gas plant at this many megawatt hours, and so forth. And this is really hard to do simply because there's so much uncertainty about things like fuel prices in 2028, 2029, 30. We don't know what demand will be. Technology is changing. The cost of lots of technologies, especially renewable technologies, are falling. So it's really hard to say what would be the least cost way to get there if you're deciding literally how much plants are running in 2030. Additionally, markets provide a lot of flexibility, for example, for small utilities, so maybe cooperatives or municipal utilities that maybe only own 1 or 2 fossil units, don't have experience building or buying, say, wind power, and then for individual unit owners. Sorry about that. So turning to rate-based compliance, just want to go through the real basics. So how does a rate-based emissions regulation work? Well, you have to be below some rate, and the rate is your emissions divided by your generation on some time scale such as a year. So you might take annual emissions and divide by annual generation. So what EPA is actually regulating and setting rules for in this rule is an adjusted emissions rate. So you have to be below this adjusted emissions rate, and you have your emissions and you're dividing by your generation plus this adjustment if needed. And this adjustment basically generation from eligible non-emitting sources like new nuclear power, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. And the adjustment is the compliance instrument, what has been referred to as an ERC, or emissions rate credit. So this is the thing that your affected units, if you were going with a rate-based plan, would literally be turning in to your state air regulator, EPA, to comply with the rule. And it represents 1 megawatt hour of emissions-free generation, and it's added to the denominator of the rate equation. So the bottom of the fraction. You add these ERCs as needed to get below your regulated rate. And there's a number of different things that are eligible to create emission reduction credits, emission rate credits, So qualifying renewable energy is basically all renewable energy, energy efficiency, new and uprated nuclear units. So the 5 new nuclear units coming in the Southeast are all going to be creating these. Affected units operating below their rate goal are also going to be generating ERCs or ERCs, and then gas shift ERCs are generated by combined cycle generation, but only if you're using subcategorized rate-based compliance. And the one other thing I should add is qualifying renewable energy and energy efficiency, this is post-2012. So it was, for example, wind that comes on after 2012, or energy efficiency where the investment made is after 2012, and then it's generation actually occurring or avoided generation during the compliance period, so from 2022 and on. So next, I wanted to just dive a bit into, so what happens, how do the markets react, how are your utilities going to change their behavior if they're under a rate-based compliance mechanism in the Clean Power Plan. So it depends on where you are relative to your rate. So if your unit is operating below the regulated rate, you're actually creating these emission rate credits. So operation literally creates a product you can sell to somebody else. So this effectively creates a subsidy for sources similar to how the production tax credit works, for example, for wind power. If your unit is operating above a regulated rate, you have to buy ERCs or ERCs. Such that you can add them to the bottom of your fraction and get below your regulated rate. And this creates an additional operating cost. And so there can be pretty big differences in how this plays out between gas units and coal units. So gas combined cycle units may actually be below their category-specific rate, especially at the beginning of the interim compliance period. And the blended rates are higher still than the category-specific rates for gas. And if you're in the subcategory-specific rate-based compliance mechanism, you're also earning gas shift emission rate credits, regardless of what your emissions are. So most gas units emit around 750 to 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour. The newer units are around 750 and maybe even a little bit below. And you can see that is a ways below 877, and then even once you get to the final rate, 770, you're still below. Whereas coal units, existing coal plants tend to emit between, say, 1,800 pounds per megawatt hour and 2,300 pounds per megawatt hour, which is a ways above the range, the declining numbers for the fossil steam category-specific rates. So coal would have to buy a lot of emission rate credits, whereas gas might actually be producing them. And then because things like new energy efficiency, renewable energy, operated nuclear, new nuclear are producing ERCs that they can then go sell, this kind of compliance mechanism literally has the effect of subsidizing these technologies. There's an incentive to develop them, to build them, because you're creating something you can sell based on them. So next, I'm going to turn to mass-based. And under a mass-based plan, you have to submit an emissions allowance for every ton of emissions that you emit out the stack for your covered sources. And EPA has calculated a mass-based goal for existing sources for each state. So this is basically your emissions budget for each state. It has also calculated a new source complement that is an add-on to that budget if you decided you wanted to include new natural gas combined cycle units under the budget, under the regulation. So EPA has set the caps essentially for you. What you as states get to decide is how to hand out, or the mechanism for distributing these allowances that let you emit a ton of CO2 from your affected units. And this is what economists are going to call allowance allocation. The policy wants the world, but that's what they're talking about. They're saying, okay, here's the budget. Here's how we're going to disperse these allowances to the affected units. So how does a mass-based system affect operation? It's pretty different, and I'm going to recall and contrast with the rate-based system. So if you have a mass-based system and you have a market, there's going to be some market price of a CO2 allowance, which you have to emit a ton of emissions. And this cost of buying the allowance, or if you have it, the opportunity cost of selling the allowance, or not selling the allowance, is the cost signal to your coal and gas units. So it's proportional to their emissions. So if the price of an allowance, say, for example, is $10 a ton, coal emits more CO2 per megawatt hour than gas, but they both have this kind of constant price signal per ton of emissions. And if you recall, with rate-based systems, you can actually have some units that are seeing a subsidy, and then those other units, namely your coal units, have to buy a lot of these ERCs. So you can get pretty different market signals, and thus fairly different outcomes from rate-based and match-based compliance mechanisms. Another key point, something that sometimes takes folks a bit of time to wrap their head around, is how you actually distribute the allowances typically does not impact the dispatch of units, meaning how the power sector, how your utilities will operate. So if you auction the allowances, that is, they have to bid into an auction to buy them from the state, or if you literally give the allowances to your affected units, they will make operations decisions exactly the same. And this is because what the cost appears as in the dispatch decision is the opportunity cost of using the allowance. So if you use the allowance, you lose the ability to sell it to somebody else. And any cost that was incurred to actually acquire the allowances initially is a sunk cost. And you're not going to make future decisions based on sunk costs. And this has actually happened in SO2 markets, in the existing CO2 markets. The one exception to this is if you're using allowances to incentivize generation. That is, people are earning allowances based on operations, and this is often referred to as output-based allocation. So if you've set up a scheme whereby your gas units are given some amount of allowance for every megawatt hour of generation, or your coal units are in a similar situation, the act of operating is creating these allowances that have value. And this encourages generation. So again, it acts as a subsidy. And you can create this output-based allocation not just for your fossil units, but you could also do it, say, for encouraging energy efficiency, renewable energy, new and existing nuclear, and so forth. And then, I said earlier that how you give out the allowances, unless you're doing this output-based allocation, does not impact how units operate. But it does have big impacts for end-use prices, meaning the prices that your ratepayers in your state are going to face. And this is especially true in restructured markets, where you basically face, there's competition to supply your retail customers. In traditional cost of service utility regulation, if you give the allowances to a utility and they make money for some reason off of them, they can't keep that money for themselves. They have to pass the savings on to ratepayers. But that clawback mechanism doesn't really work, or doesn't exist in competitive restructured markets. Another question that I've seen come up a fair amount is, well, what about load growth? And what about this decision to build new units? What if I need to build a bunch of new gas units? So the first thing I would note is that the rule does not restrict load growth. It restricts emissions from covered sources. So it's certainly possible to generate more to meet more load without increasing your carbon emissions through things like increased energy efficiency. You could increase your imports. You could build new nuclear units, renewables, and so forth. In the rate-based world, new natural gas combined cycle units are outside of the regulation. So you can build new natural gas combined cycle units. The rate-based regulation will be creating market signals that will affect the decision to do that, but basically there's nothing that says you can't just go build as much new natural gas combined cycle as you need. For mass-based covering just existing units, you can build new natural gas combined cycle generation, but what EDA is attempting to do is to create an economic incentive to basically operate your existing gas units. And Tom earlier mentioned this issue of addressing leakage. This is what EPA is trying to do. They're trying to create a signal to continue to run your existing gas units, as well as some other signals to encourage renewable energy. And this is through some output-based allocation schemes. And then if you went with a mass-based system covering new and existing units, so including new natural gas combined cycle units, you would also cap emissions for new units. So you could potentially have a different dynamic in the decision and availability of building new gas to meet load going forward. Real quickly, I wanted to touch a bit more on allowance allocation in mass-based compliance systems. It's the difficult decision, I think, when a state is writing a mass-based plan. I should note that rate-based plans are more administratively complex, and I'm not trying to say, rate is better than mass or mass is better than rate. I'm just trying to point out a big topic if you do go down the mass-based path. So in terms of allocation, you have basically three options. You can distribute the allowances based on past action, so historical generation, historical emissions. This is what is typically referred to as grandfathering. So if you do this, you need to have a rationale. So why, what are you using as the metric? Is it past generation or past emissions? Past emissions or generation when? What is your year? Is it a series of years? And then if you're continuing to give allowances to utilities and others based on what happened in the past, there's a chance that some of those units are actually going to retire in the future, and then people are still being given allowances. And allowances have value. So you could be in a situation where the state plan is giving allowances to someone who is no longer operating a power plant and then maybe can just sell those allowances. So there's the potential for windfall profits with these grandfathering allowance mechanisms. The other thing you can do is you can auction allowances. This is essentially leaving it up to the market to decide how allowances are initially distributed. People have to buy them. This is going to generate some revenue, and this revenue can be used for a number of different things, but one thing that has often been done is it's given back to ratepayers, essentially. You can use it to reduce rate impacts. And then finally, there's updating. So this earn by operating such that you earn allowances by running your gas plants or running your coal plants. And then finally, I wanted to touch briefly on the trading ready provisions included in the final rule. And from a cost perspective, this is a pretty big deal, and it should states decide to take advantage of this reduced cost and ease compliance, simply because wider markets will lower total system costs when there's more opportunity to buy and sell. So if you have a market-based mechanism, the market's going to find the lowest cost way to meet the constraint of the rule. And the wider the market, the better it can find those least cost mechanisms. And also, trading mechanisms, especially Y trading mechanisms, are essentially the ultimate reliability safety valve. There is no transmission constraint in emissions markets. Florida could buy, for example, allowances from Washington State, and if there's a very wide supply, there should always be allowances or ERCs out there for your utilities to purchase. You know, if there's some event like a nuclear unit going offline, the price for those might rise, but you'll still be able to essentially go and buy them. And there's also gains from essentially wide markets just because of geography. So different states have lots of wind, some have lots of solar, some have very low gas prices. You know, a wider market can take advantage of that. There will likely be differences in demand growth rates across the country, as well as differences in weather. So you could have a very mild summer in one part of the country, but a hot summer in another part. And weather is basically the biggest short-term driver of electricity demand. And then there could be unexpected opportunities, things we haven't thought of, some sort of resource that a utility or EGU owner has, that if there's a wider market can enable gains both for the seller and the buyer. And the last thing I would like to point out is that low-cost states also win under trading ready. So if you're a state with very low-cost, say, market clearing price for an allowance, say it's just $1 a ton, but you joined a wider trading group and that increased to $10 a ton, you would still be better off because you're going to literally make money reducing emissions. And you're only going to do it if it's cost effective. So with that, I will stop. We have a number of additional resources on our website, which you can access here. And I believe Ben is going to next turn to the questions.
Thanks, David. Obviously, a lot for states to consider as September approaches. I would now like to move on to the question and answer portion. Don't forget, if you have a question, please type it in the box in the lower left-hand corner. And of course, before that, I do just want to thank our three speakers today. So thank you very much. I know you can't hear me clapping, but I am. Anyway, to the questions, we got a couple, actually more than a couple while the presentations were ongoing. And the first one, Jacob, is probably best, I guess, addressed to you, but Tom or David, feel free to chime in if you have some other thoughts as well. And that really is, what criteria will EPA use to decide whether a state's plan is approvable?
Sure. So I think the simplest way to answer that is to refer the questioner elicit to Section 8D of the Clean Power Plan, which lays out the approvability criteria, which essentially we point to the components of the state plan submittal. And some of those components are the same for all types of state plans, no matter if it's rate-based or mass-based or state measures or whatnot. Things like demonstrating that the state will achieve the CO2 emissions performance rate or the emissions goal, the description of the plan overall and the geographic scope, the applicability to the affected EGUs, things like that. And then there's a whole set of specific criteria for each type of state plan. So the emission standards type for rate and for mass, and the state measures plans. And those are all listed out pretty clearly in the Clean Power Plan under Section 8D, items 1 and 2 within that.
Great, thank you. This next question is probably best for Tom and Jacob. And really kind of based on the fact that EPA issued an endangerment finding for carbon dioxide in 2009 and is more or less compelled by the President to issue regulations for carbon dioxide from power plants. What happens if this, if the Clean Power Plan does not survive, the current legal challenges? I mean, to put it maybe, I don't know if this is too blunt, but does it kind of go back to the drawing board?
I think, Jacob, unless you want to venture into this, do you want me to take that?
I think given the status of, the litigation and the state petitions and things like that, Tom, it's probably better for you to answer.
That's what I thought you would say. Okay, so much of this depends on how the court rules. If the court rules in favor of the challengers on the 111, 112 argument, or essentially guts the rule by saying all but building block 1, which is the heat rate improvements that get you only maybe 2 to 4% emission reductions, if that's the way it comes down, then I think, EPA has got a couple of options. One is they could try to do a national ambient air quality standard. That hasn't been tried yet. That would be difficult because it's not clear how you would ever assess whether any particular area of the country is in attainment of that standard. But that's sort of the remaining tool. I guess you could also try to characterize CO2 as a hazardous air pollutant and do a standard under Section 112. But I haven't thought through the implications of that. The other obvious option is legislation. This is there have been attempts to legislate in this area before. They've been unsuccessful. There will likely be attempts again in the future. So, those are the things that I see. Now, if the court issues a more narrow ruling, such as saying that EPA overstepped and interfered on the state's roles in this, then EPA could essentially repromulgate a very similar rule, but let the states establish the targets. So, Jacob, any comment, any thought on that?
No, I'll stay silent. I guess the only thing I'll say is that a stay is not a rejection of the rule. It's just a temporary pause.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm talking about a ruling on the merits. No, a stay. The D.C. Circuit tends to be very cautious when they issue stays. They say almost nothing about the merits of the case because they do not prejudge them. And stays are oftentimes really dependent on the issue of irreparable harm. Have you shown that the challengers to a rule will be harmed absent a stay while the litigation is going on?
And Tom, we just got a quick follow-up. I know you touched on this in your presentation, but what would, if you could just summarize the timeline for the court to, decide?
There's a couple possible timelines. The most ambitious would have the case argued by the D.C. Circuit in mid-May, with a decision from the D.C. Circuit probably by the end of July. That is very, very ambitious. It's what I'd like to see here, including the parties that I'm representing, but whether the D.C. Circuit will require it is here. The other schedule would likely have the cases briefed by the middle of the summer, argument sometime in the fall, and a decision by the end of the year. I think in either case we can expect Supreme Court review during 2017.
Great, thank you. David, this next question is for you, and I guess maybe to summarize, given your work through Duke University, what have you, with regard to whether states will submit implementation plans this year, or have you heard more that they're going to be submitting a request for an extension?
I believe the vast majority of states, through articles and so forth, that I read through services like Greenwire and ClimateWire, have indicated that they are going to ask for extensions. I think there might be one or two that are going to try and submit a final state plan in September, but I think for the vast majority of states, people are going to ask for the extension.
Great. Jacob, another question we got towards the end of your presentation was whether or not a state can receive CEIP credits for renewable or energy efficiency investments made prior to 2020 and 2021, but continue to be in operation in 2020 and moving forward.
Sure. So the basic trigger is when the state submits its final plan. So if a state submitted its final plan by September of 2016, later this year, then any wind or solar that began construction after that point, or any low-income energy efficiency that began operations after that point, would be eligible for the power, zero carbon power generated, or for the wind or solar, or the zero emissions offset, or not emitted, the power emissions not emitted as a result of the low-income energy efficiency during 2020 and 2021. That makes sense. So imagine a wind power plant that starts construction immediately on that day, and they start generating power on January 1st, 2019. They do not get credit for the power in 2019. but they do get what we propose. This is all what we proposed or what we put into the final power plan, clean power plan, is that they would then get credit 2020 and 2021 for that. But if they completed the construction before that date that they signed, that would not count. And the same corollary thing for energy efficiency. All of these sort of final implementation decisions will be made in the course of this additional action that we're planning later for this spring. So there will be an additional opportunity to comment on all of that and provide us feedback on all of that. That's what was proposed.
And just a quick follow-up. I mean, does the CEIP as currently designed, is there the possibility that they could discourage current in renewable energy and energy efficiency?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. Certainly, I mean, an additional thing that's happened, certainly since the Clean Power Plan was finalized, was the extension of for the renewables, the production and investment tax credit. So I think that's probably going to drive the investment in wind and solar over the next couple of years. And as those phase down, is starting next year, but through I think 2020, 2021. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. I think the incentive from the Clean Energy Incentive Program could be very substantial in continuing some of those investments through that time. And for energy efficiency projects, there's absolutely no disincentive to do them now. The more you do now, the more those programs will have a chance to grow, and the more they'll be able to achieve during 2020 and 2021.
Great, thanks. Well, that is all the questions that I've got. I really just want to once again, I'd like to extend a thank you to you, Jacob, Tom, and David for joining us today as speakers. A really great job kind of breaking down the Clean Power Plan. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar will be made available shortly at the website you can see on your screen. And again, you can download today's slides in the media library icon, which is in the kind of upper right-hand corner. It is a blue and yellow icon just to the right of the microphone. So again, thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL. Have a great day and a happy belated New Year. Thank you again.